Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome from CNBC, Hadley Gamble.
I'm Hadley Gamble with CNBC. Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the visible hand, what policies that governments can put in place to drive growth and hopefully prevent the next financial crisis. But first, we're going to look at a poll question, which should be appearing up here. If you'll go to your phones, you should have downloaded the app earlier today. What policy changes are most capable of driving economic growth in your country? So while you make your votes, I'd like to invite our panelists to the stage. I'm not going to lie, I never knew that I would be hosting Jeopardy! So it looks as if, when we talk about tax reform, regulatory reforms, ease of doing business, economic stimulus, and free market reforms, we've got a bit of a tie, don't we? Tax reform, regulatory reforms, economic stimulus, all of them seem to tie out there. I want to take this moment to introduce our distinguished panelists. We have His Excellency Liam Fox, the Secretary of State for International Trade for the UK. We also have, of course, His Excellency Zayed Al-Zayani, the Minister of Industry and Commerce from Tourism in Bahrain. Her Excellency, Dr. Sahar Nasser, the Minister of Investment and International Cooperation for the Ministry of Investment in Egypt, as well as His Excellency Pier Carlo Padoan, the Minister of Economy and Finance in Italy. Panelists, welcome.
Thank you.
We're at an inflection point, not only here in the Middle East, but also, of course, in Europe as well. You have highly indebted governments, and you also have, of course, the pressures that come with a migrant crisis, the pressures that come from lower oil prices, populism, nationalism, and even religious strife. And the question, of course, is how can governments balance fiscal prudence with meeting the demands of their populations? I want to kick off with Dr. Nasser. When we talk about Egypt, you have a population of 95 million. You've had to deal with political instability, terrorism, all of these external pressures really having a serious impact on the economy. When you look at what happens next, what measures is the government taking to really kickstart economic growth in Egypt?
Thank you for an interesting question. Actually, you're very right. Coming out of revolutions, uprisings, you often fall between like a challenge. You need to strike. People have a lot of optimism. They feel that everything will be shiny and bright and all their dreams are going to come true. They're very optimistic and they're very ambitious about what they can achieve. But at the same time, the economy is facing major challenges, obviously. And hence, it is quite a big task for the government, along with the various stakeholders, to address these challenges. How to meet people's aspirations and with the limited budget that you have and the little private sector investments that had left the country during crisis times. So we had to move very quickly. The first phase was a fiscal stimulus, infrastructure, because the infrastructure is the prerequisite for bringing in the private sector in. But you also want to make sure people have access to the utilities, water, sanitation, the highways. That's also very important to improve their standard of living, to also address their dreams. So on that front, we've done major milestones in terms of roads and highways, major modernizations of the ports, but also more important, we've worked on the renewable energy, access to electricity and the renewable energy. We've launched a strategy whereby the year 2022 we will have 20% at least of renewable diversification, solar, wind, and making sure that the lagging regions do have access to these utilities. But simultaneously, we also moved with improving the business environment that you've highlighted in your very first statement, which is how can you encourage the private sector to come in, bring back the investors that had to leave the country during difficult times, And that's already very visible. We can see with the new investment law, with the amendments in the companies and the capital markets law, we're already bringing, FDI has significantly picked up. We've reached this last fiscal year, 7.9, and we're targeting $10 billion for next year, but even the IMF and the World Bank are projecting 12 billion. So we're on track, but we're also moving into investing in people. It's very important that we invest in people, in their education, the skills, capacity building, their healthcare, because people are the main pillar based on which we will achieve sustainable and inclusive growth.
When you talk about corruption, Egypt has made significant strides in tackling corruption over the last several years. But when we talk about the opportunity for another crisis to unfold, a sense of unfair competition is certainly something that folks in Egypt that I speak to are very concerned about. When you look at what's been happening, is there a measure that the government can take to address this? Not just family-owned companies who are entrenched in the system, but also in terms of the military itself. How can the government make sure that competition is fair?
On competition, we believe that without healthy competition and through competition, we would not achieve growth. And we know that the private sector plays a very pivotal role. And that brings me back to the point, for example, when I mentioned highways, there were some concerns regarding crowding out. And I said at this very early phase, when the private sector was not stepping in, when the private sector needed a more conducive environment, this is when the government had to step in with a fiscal package so that you set the ground for more private sector. So the second phase is we moved with the legislative reforms. How can you bring more private sector participation? So, and how to improve the governance structure. You've referred also to the governance structure, more accountability and more transparency in doing business. And the figures are actually evidence of what is happening in the economy and what is happening in the market. So when you see, for example, the feed-in tariff is a very good example. This is a sector that had no private sector participation at all during the last 3 decades. You're bringing in the private sector in for the feed-in tariff. The gas sector, that was a sector that was banned. Private sector was not allowed. Now the gas law has been amended and is now discussed at the parliament where private sector participation. So you can see also private sector coming in new sectors that they were not active at all in, but also an environment that is encouraging expansion. So you look at all the different companies, not just from Saudi, but also from the US, from the UK, from Germany, companies like Siemens, some companies like GE, injecting a huge investment just during the last few months is an evidence, because I read the performance from the market. That's the real sector that counts.
And finally, I want to ask you, given the significant strides that Egypt has made under President Sisi in terms of trying to rejigger their economy, get the economy back on track, that has increased government debt enormously. What's your government planning to do to rein that in?
Yeah. I'm happy you highlighted that, because that's an issue that keeps on coming up. I always look at especially loans coming from international financial institutions such as the World Bank, such as the African Development Bank, such as the European Investment Bank or the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The way we negotiate and the way we allocate these funds is where we put 4 conditionalities there before we sign off. As a Minister of Investment and International Cooperation, before signing off on any documents, I make sure first that this authority that is borrowing has the capacity to pay back. I make sure that this is investing in a sector, whether it's infrastructure or the social housing, that is able to repay it back, and also has some positive externalities and has social implications. And hence, Egypt, for history, even during difficult times that you referred to earlier on, has never defaulted at any point in time. We're always paying back. And these authorities that have been borrowing have always been paying. Some policies that are earmarked and targeted to policy reforms, such as the major and bold fiscal and monetary reforms that President Sisi moved forward with a grand vision for our country, rebuilding institutions, growing our economies, is basically like the devaluation, the flotation of the currency. This has actually helped bring in, so the budget support that was provided to the World Bank, the African Development, and the IMF has really helped us move forward with the program.
Now, speaking of government indebtedness, Mr. Fox, I want to ask you about what's happening with Brexit, because I know you're going to tell me that people are not uncertain, but I have to tell you there is a lot of uncertainty surrounding Brexit and what's going to happen to the UK. Is London going to continue to be the financial center of the world?
Well, look what's actually happened since our referendum. We've continued to add jobs to our economy. We've now got a record number of people in employment in the UK of all time. We've got the lowest unemployment since we measured it in a consistent way since the early 1970s. Last year, the first full year after the referendum, we had a record amount of inward investment into the United Kingdom, the highest in our history. And when you say to people, why are you investing in the United Kingdom, notwithstanding that there's a bit of uncertainty around what our future relationship with the EU will be.
A bit.
Well, let me tell you what people say. They say we invest in the United Kingdom because the fundamentals are strong. We believe in your rule of law, we understand it. You've got a skilled workforce. You've got a low regulation economy, a low taxation economy, a cutting-edge research base, some of the best universities in the world, you speak English, and you're in a good zone for global trading. Now, that's why investment is continuing to come in. Now, in terms of the European debate, we're leaving the European Union, the political element that is the European Union. We're not leaving Europe, and we're not leaving the global economy. And we want to have a full and open trading relationship with our European partners, and we hope that's what they will want with us, because that's good for them and it's good for us. And to put any impediments would be bad.
Tweeting that Frankfurt is going to be the new center of financial work in Europe. I mean, doesn't that concern you, that that wealth will leave the UK?
No, because London is and has been for some time the premier financial centre in the world. It has a depth of professional infrastructure that really extends across the United Kingdom. It's got a level of liquidity that is hard to find anywhere else, and people trust the legal system. And that is why I think it will continue to be there. I mean, if you want to put it in shorthand, people say that money will go where money can be made, money can be moved, and money can be removed. And that is a function of law, and that's why London, I believe, will remain preeminent.
Mr. Padua, I want to bring you in here as really the representative from Europe. This is a pretty rosy picture that Mr. Fox is painting. What's your take?
Well, my take is that once Brexit is completed, the EU will not be the same again. I am fully aware of the fact that the UK and London in particular has been a very attractive place to invest and to locate services, financial industry and others. I am a bit more skeptical about the fact that after Brexit is completed, this will be untouched. And I'm not saying this because I like the view, because this is going to be a fact. At the same time, and this I'm saying because it's happening, I'm convinced that also because of Brexit, the European Union will accelerate its integration. So there might be some acceleration of the differences between the UK out of the European Union and the rest of the European Union. I'm not happy about this, but I think this is going to happen.
Mr. Fox, I want to ask you a little bit about what Brexit will actually look like. I mean, at this point, there are real questions over whether or not Prime Minister Theresa May is going to actually continue to have the support of her party moving forward. What's Brexit going to look like?
Well, what it looks like will depend on the agreement we get with our European Union partners. We've set out what we want. And if you think about this, this is a unique negotiation. Normally, in a trade negotiation, the partners begin some distance apart and try to negotiate to the closest possible position.
You're happy with a no-deal Brexit.
In the United Kingdom and the European Union, we begin with maximal coincidence. We have zero tariffs and 100% regulatory equivalence. So all that can happen is either we stay the same or we move further apart. And if we move further apart, that's purely for political, not for economic reasons. Now, I hope that economic sense will prevail, because the world needs trade liberalization, not to roll in the opposite direction. But where I do entirely agree is that I think as Britain leaves the European Union is not a static model either. And I think it's exactly right. We heard from Mr. Juncker that the plans are there to move to greater integration, a single European elected parliament, president, to see greater integration in European defence forces. And I think these developments actually risk fragmenting Europe, I think, is the wrong direction for Europe to go in. It's one of the reasons why I voted and campaigned to leave. I didn't want to live in a Europe where the nation states were being diminished by greater supranational integration. So I think there are all sorts of questions there that will take some time to sort out, because I think there are a lot of countries who will find that direction of travel very uncomfortable.
Mr. Padoan, you want to follow on that in terms of the direction of the European project going forward?
Sorry.
In terms of the direction of the European project going forward?
Well, the European project is very rich. It's now at a point which I would define of a window of opportunity. The reason is that Europe is growing at a healthy pace and now needs to turn its attention to, after having repaired the consequences of the financial crisis, strengthening its institutional architecture and adding to that architecture to make it even more integrated. So this is where I think Europe is going, and indeed we will have between this December and the early summer of next year 2 major councils dedicated to the reform of the economic model in the European Union and in the Eurozone. There is a lot of debate, different views between different countries. We still need to see what the new German government will think about the future of Europe. Whatever the case, I am convinced that Europe will emerge from this phase of negotiation stronger, more dynamic, at a condition that we will have to work hard on issues such as currency, such as banking, such as public policy, but also take a serious look at how we can improve our growth policies and employment support policies.
Is there a chance then that your government and Mr. Macron's government in France and Angela Merkel's government, when she forms it, are going to be able to work together to push this agenda and lead the way?
Well, Europe has always been the result of agreements among some countries, and I'm convinced that this will be the same in the future. We have gone a long way since when in 2010 the Greek crisis erupted. There were no such thing as a banking union, which eventually was built and allowed to deal with the crisis. Now all the European countries are out of a crisis mode. They're all growing. They have to grow more. There is a huge structural agenda to be completed, including doing more in the single market agenda, because the single market is the single most powerful driver of growth for Europe.
When you look at what's happening here in Saudi Arabia, for example, opportunities for Italy to expand in terms of their export sector, what are the opportunities to work with Saudi Arabia going forward?
Sorry,
In terms of Saudi Arabia as an investment destination, Saudi Arabia
sorry,
as an export market, what opportunities do you see in the kingdom?
Listening to this grand project, Vision 2030, in Saudi Arabia, the thought that came to my mind that this is a great opportunity for this country, but also a great opportunity for many other countries, including European countries, because if there is a project that leads the way towards transformation of the economy, transformation of society, diversification, this is a great investment opportunity inside the country, but also investment opportunities for companies looking more closely at what's happening here. And certainly I can see in a scenario where there is more integration between Saudi Arabia and Europe, driven by new technological opportunities and investment opportunities. After all, technology and innovation must be the driver of growth for Europe in the future. Europe is an aging society, so we need to find sources of productivity mostly outside the labor force.
Mr. Fox, if you want to add on to that, I mean, obviously your government says they want to look for new deals, new trade partners.
Well, it's not just a question of new deals or new partners. The point is that 90% of global growth over the next 10 to 15 years will come outside Europe. That's the assessment of the European Union itself. And we need to position ourselves in those areas where there will be both that growth in export opportunities and investment opportunities. And I think the Vision 2030 is extraordinarily important, even more than an economic project, because there is a continuum between prosperity, social stability, political stability, and international security. And we cannot interrupt any one part of that without interrupting all the parts of it. And one of the great things about the vision here, which is why it's so exciting as well as courageous, is that it understands that if you can provide prosperity so that the economy does work for everyone, then that underpins social cohesion and security. And it actually offers a potential, not just for Saudi Arabia, not even for its bilateral trading partners, of which the United Kingdom would clearly be one of the biggest, but it offers regional and even global geopolitical stability. It is a tremendous opportunity, and it's a vision that we need to turn into reality. First of all, because failure would be unthinkable, but secondly, because the gains we could make and the prize that is within our grasp is truly historic.
Mr. Padoan, when we talk about the security relationships between the region and Europe, Saudi Arabia and the European Union in particular, what's your take on how that could benefit people who are struggling as migrants in Europe today?
Well, thanks for that question, because that strikes at the heart of one of the challenges that Europe is facing right now. You can take a view of the migrant problem as an emergency, as a pressure on your borders. But you can also take the view that this is, in the medium term, a big opportunity to further integrate Europe with the Mediterranean. But of course, in order to achieve that, so that these flows of people that are seeking better living conditions elsewhere are transformed into real integration, you need to take a European view in the solution. Is what, in the debate about the European budget and its possible reform, we talk of European public goods. To be very simple, the idea is that if there is a European challenge / opportunity in migrants, how to regulate these flows, how to integrate these people needs a European response in terms of policy, in terms of budget, in terms of resources, in terms of shared responsibilities.
I want to bring in Mr. Ziani. When we talk about the relationships between the GCC countries, obviously Bahrain has a long historical relationship with the kingdom and also with their partners in the UAE as well. I want to ask you, in terms of the regional security question, how big an impact the crisis with the Qataris has had on Bahrain and the region in terms of investor sentiment?
I thought Brexit was tough. Now you put me in a corner. I think the issue we have with Qatar is not something that is of a long-term nature. It's a dispute. It's going to get solved sooner or later. In the meantime, we are continuing with our plans. We're sticking the course. We're building our economy. We're diversifying our economy further. And so far, we have seen positive results as far as Bahrain and the rest of the other GCC countries, that we are maintaining growth despite the political issues going on in the region, despite the drop in the oil prices. I can talk more specifically about Bahrain. We are very glad to say that 80% of our GDP is driven by the private sector today. In the year 2000, oil contributed 44% to our economy. Today, it's down to 20%. So diversification has paid for us. We started diversification process in the 1960s, going into industry and specifically into the aluminum industry.
But you are still highly dependent on those revenues, and oil prices do have a big impact on your economy. Is it time for some serious reforms in terms of potentially taxes and a VAT?
No, not. I think taxes not right away, but what VAT is coming. That's something that's been announced, and it's coming throughout the GCC, not in Bahrain. I think for the short term, we are looking at a consumer-based tax system on consumption mainly, not on income, and that will remain in place for a while. But that's not the only way to go ahead. I think we are, like Saudi Arabia, we have a challenge of a young population, and we have to create more diversity in our economy to create jobs for these young people coming into the workforce. Governments can no longer continuously expand because of the pressures we face in our budgets. So it's up to the private sector to take more of a lead and to take more of the employment opportunities for these young people. What government is doing, on the other hand, is we're trying to encourage a new sector, which is the entrepreneurship, SMEs, development of
What gives you a competitive edge in that sector?
Education. We have a very high education level. We have, like Saudi and like we heard from His Royal Highness Prince Mohammed, we have a very motivated young population, very tech savvy. They're all used to IT. We are expanding in that field as well. The EDB has launched plans to support fintech, to support the IT sector. We're moving Bahrain into a digital economy. We recently announced that Amazon Web Services will be setting up in Bahrain their first data storage operations in the Middle East and Africa. The government has also announced moving to a cloud-based system. So we're moving into the next frontier, I think, the digital age of managing businesses, where you can benefit from more efficiencies, less laborious work, but more output generated from that work.
But the challenges really do remain for Bahrain in terms of a double-digit budget deficit, and your debt to GDP ratio is expected to top 100, I think, % of GDP in a year, sort of a few years. And the question I would have then, I think that all of us are asking is, you know, in the past, countries like Egypt, countries like Bahrain have been dependent on Saudi Arabia, the UAE, to help them out in times of crisis. Given the geopolitical tensions as well as the fiscal troubles that these countries have faced, can you really continue to depend on a big brother to help you out?
I think yes, and that was evident through the GCC fund, which we received from Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Kuwait. Again, I go back to our GDP. The solution is to expand the economy and to grow the GDP. You can pay off your debt, or you can raise your GDP and have a better equation on the ratios. We need to do both, but we can grow our GDP quicker. We are definitely thankful and grateful for the support we get from the 3 GCC countries. Because of that, we have $32 billion of projects in the pipeline between the next 3 and 4 years. That's equivalent to Bahrain's GDP. $7.5 billion of that is from the GCC fund. The rest comes from both private sector and semi-government-owned companies. We are expanding in the aluminum sector again with Alba, and that creates a whole new downstream spectrum for us. The downstream aluminum sector in Bahrain is one of the largest employers today, and that's going to grow further. And we're focusing on sectors that we can be advantageous, that we have advantages in the Gulf, and we can be highly competitive on. We want to leverage our location in the middle of the Gulf to be a hub for the Gulf, and we want to use our excellent logistics systems to support all the Gulf economies.
And panelists, as we only have a few minutes left, I just wanted to quickly ask each of you what your hopes are for the next 12 months. Mr. Fox.
Well, I want to see us committing ourselves at the trade ministers meeting in Buenos Aires to an open global economy, because we can have as much innovation as we want, but we've got to have open trading to make the best of that for the sake of our people. Back in 2010, the G20 countries were operating 300 non-tariff barriers to trade. By the end of 2015, we were operating 1,200 non-tariff barriers to trade. The rich countries have to keep their trading open so that developing countries can trade their way out of poverty. That is the way that we stop increases in global radicalism and increases in global mass migration. We've got to ensure that prosperity through open trade reaches as many people as possible.
Mr. Padawan.
Well, I would say that what I'd like to see in the future, actually starting now, is to have all the economic policy instruments we have at our disposal nationally and regionally and globally, fiscal, monetary, structural, to achieve a more inclusive growth. This is a dimension we tend to forget. We need to grow more, especially in some parts of the world. We need to provide employment opportunities, but we also need to share and expand the benefits of growth through appropriate policies. So the inclusive dimension must be part of the policy agenda at the global level. And the G20 have already moved in that direction, and the international community also echoed this in the recent meetings at the IMF and World Bank. And this can be done concretely, although in different countries one could see different situations in different cases, but the principle must be the same.